When Ellie Monroe inherited a rusted metal shed on the edge of a decommissioned World War II airfield, she expected dust, cobwebs, and maybe a few bird nests. What she didn't expect was the hulking shadow of an F6F Hellcat fighter still intact, still sealed behind corroded doors, and still carrying secrets in its cockpit. As she wiped decades of grime from the fuselage, something about the plane felt unfinished, like it had been waiting for someone. And when the propeller shifted just barely, the hair on her arms stood up. This wasn't just restoration, it was resurrection. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's episode has a discovery even deeper beneath the surface, and trust us, you won't want to miss it. The wind off the southern pines rustled dry grass around the forgotten corner of Birchfield Airfield, where a long abandoned corrugated tin shed leaned into time like a soldier long at ease. Ellie Monroe stood before it, one hand on her hip, the other holding a key she wasn't sure would even fit the ancient padlock. The shed had belonged to her grandfather, or so the paperwork claimed, tucked into the last lines of a probate file so dusty it seemed more rumor than record. No one had opened this place since 1954. That's what the lawyer said. But Ellie, 29, a certified airframe mechanic, and the last Monroe left in the county, had come to see for herself. The door groaned when it gave way, revealing a shaft of dust-filtered light that sliced through the shadows. The air inside was thick with machine oil and rust, and the scent hit her like a memory she never lived. Rows of toolboxes lined the walls, untouched. Cobwebs sagged from rafters like forgotten flags. And then she saw it. A tail fin, blue-gray and massive, emerging from the dark like the back of some sleeping steel creature. She stepped in, boots echoing on cracked concrete, her breath catching as her eyes adjusted. It was a plane. Not just any plane. An F6F Hellcat. The kind her grandfather had flown. The nose faced the far wall, propeller blades still in place, wings folded like prayer hands, dust coated everything. The glass of the cockpit was streaked but unbroken. Its navy paint, though faded, still bore the U.S. insignia. Ellie reached out and ran her fingers across the fuselage, feeling a pulse beneath the metal. Not literal, but undeniable. Whoever left it here hadn't abandoned it. They'd preserved it, protected it. She circled the aircraft slowly, eyes tracing every rivet. There were no signs of tampering, no graffiti, no animals, just time and silence. Beneath the plane, a wooden crate rested with a faded stencil. U.S. Navy, Supply 844. Beside it, half covered by a tarp, sat a stack of sealed metal canisters and a dented mechanic's journal wrapped in oilcloth. Ellie dropped to one knee and flipped the journal open. The pages were yellowed but legible, filled with schematics, handwritten notes, and a name signed again and again. Lieutenant Jack Monroe, her grandfather. She swallowed, chest tightening. He'd never talked much about the war, just quiet dinners and cryptic toasts to the ones who never landed. She thought it was just grief. But this was a chapter he never told. And suddenly, Ellie knew this wasn't just a barn find. This was a mission. She closed the journal and looked up at the Hellcat, towering, quiet, waiting. "I'm going to get you flying again," she whispered. The metal didn't answer, but in the stillness, she swore the dust shifted like the plane exhaled. The next morning, Ellie arrived at the shed just after sunrise, the air still cool with the breath of October. She had barely slept, her thoughts looping endlessly around what she'd found. The shed wasn't just a relic, it was a sealed story, a whisper from the past in the shape of a fighter plane. She pushed the door open again, sunlight pooling across the floor and lighting up the dust like mist. The Hellcat stood where she'd left it, unchanged, and yet impossibly different now that she knew its story was connected to hers. She walked a slow circle around the aircraft, this time with intention. Her mechanic's eyes took over, scanning the joints, panel lines, and control surfaces. The skin of the fuselage was surprisingly intact, a little corrosion at the seams, some surface rust on exposed bolts, but nothing catastrophic. Whoever had stored it had done so with care. She checked the landing gear, half expecting the rubber tires to have crumbled. But even those still held weight. Cracked and dry, yes, but not destroyed. Near the tail, a cluster of faded kill marks had been hand-painted just below the canopy. 6, maybe 7-1 had worn almost completely away. She brushed the paint gently with her thumb, her skin tingling. This was real. A machine of war, once flown in combat, once cared for by the man who raised her father. A machine that had been deliberately hidden and kept secret for reasons she couldn't begin to guess. Back near the nose, Ellie noticed a maintenance panel slightly ajar. She grabbed a wrench from one of the rusted toolboxes and eased the cover off. Inside was a tangle of wires and tubing, aged but eerily intact. She expected mice, nesting, damage, but there was none. No sign of intrusion. Everything had been sealed up tight, preserved, not abandoned. She moved to the cockpit ladder next, hesitating only briefly before climbing up. The canopy latch groaned but released. Inside, the seat was wrapped in cracked leather, a helmet still resting on it. Oxygen masks, belts, dials all in place, yellowed but untouched. The control stick stood centered, a faded photograph of a woman tucked beneath the altimeter. Ellie pulled it free and studied it. The woman wore a uniform, smiled like she knew something secret. There were initials on the back. C.M. 1944. Ellie sat back on the cockpit edge, legs dangling, heart racing. She didn't know what she had expected. Maybe a broken plane, forgotten and falling apart. But this was something else. This was like finding a heartbeat in a coffin. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up the flight log from beside the throttle. Pages were still legible. The last entry, the 14th of May, 1945. Engine test successful. Awaiting clearance for return. Return from where? Or to where? She climbed back down slowly, feeling like she was walking in a dream. Beneath the aircraft, the wooden crate she'd noticed the day before had markings scorched into the side, not just paint. Burned in. Navy classified. Do not open. But someone had years ago. Its lid had been removed and repurposed as a makeshift workbench, now covered in oil stains, a couple of wrenches, and a single, sealed envelope. Her name was written on the front, in ink, faded but unmistakable. Ellie Monroe. She stared at it, suddenly unsteady. How? Why? She picked it up with both hands like it might break. Her fingers hovered over the flap, her breath shallow. Whatever was inside wasn't just meant for her hands, it was meant for her heart, and she wasn't ready for what it might say. Not yet. Not alone. Ellie sat cross-legged on the concrete floor, the envelope resting in her lap. Dust hung heavy in the air, glowing gold in the shaft of sunlight cutting through a hole in the roof. She turned the envelope over again and again, the paper stiff, yellowed, and slightly brittle. Whoever wrote her name had done it with care, bold, cursive, almost formal, but with a tremor in the final E, as if written by someone old or emotional. Her throat tightened. She tore it open carefully. Inside were two things: a short note and a key wrapped in cloth. The note read, "If you're reading this, it means you found her. Keep the promise your grandfather couldn't finish. C.M. C.M. The same initials as the woman in the cockpit photo. Ellie's pulse quickened. The letter was short, but every word carried weight. Found her. Keep the promise. She glanced back at the Hellcat's polished nose reflecting morning light, and suddenly realized this was no random relic. This was a story paused mid-sentence, waiting for her to turn the page. She reached for the cloth wrapping the key and unrolled it. Beneath the folds, coated in old grease, lay a small brass ignition key stamped F6F 44. It was heavier than it looked, cold in her palm. She turned it over and noticed faint etching along the edge, tiny letters carved by hand. For Jack, her grandfather's name. Ellie closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady the storm inside her. The shed felt suddenly smaller, the air thicker. She looked up at the aircraft again, and the realization hit hard this wasn't just her grandfather's plane. It was part of something much larger, maybe even something secret. But the question that burned through her thoughts was, why her? Why leave this for a granddaughter who was barely born when her grandfather died? She searched the rest of the crate and found a small rectangular shape, wedged at the bottom a second layer of oilcloth. She pulled it free, unwrapped it, and uncovered a bound flight log, its leather cover dark with oil stains and time. The first page read, U.S. Navy F6F Hellcat vertical bar aircraft No. 412 vertical bar, assigned pilot. Lieutenant Jack Monroe. The handwriting was unmistakably her grandfather's, steady, neat, confident. The entries spanned missions over the Pacific, mechanical repairs, fuel checks, weather notes, all meticulously documented, but halfway through, the tone shifted. The notes became personal, shorter, more emotional. Mission canceled, orders changed. CM disagrees, says something's off. Plane to be grounded indefinitely, awaiting further instruction. The last entry was written in a shaking hand. She's being hidden at Birchfield. It's safer that way. If someone ever finds this, finish what we started. Ellie's eyes blurred as she traced the final sentence. Her grandfather had hidden this plane on purpose and someone, maybe CM, had preserved it. But from what? Or from whom? She wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve, her breath coming faster. She looked around the shed, her gaze landing on an old wall cabinet half buried in vines. The lock was rusted solid, but the key she held, the key for Jack, felt like it belonged there. She slid it in. It turned with a groan. Inside, the shelves were lined with carefully wrapped metal containers, grease-stained blueprints, and a rolled-up canvas map marked in red ink. Across the top of the map were the words Operation Silent Wing. Ellie stared, pulse pounding. Whatever her grandfather had been part of, it hadn't been an ordinary assignment. And the Hellcat sitting behind her wasn't just a forgotten relic. It was evidence. The cabinet's hinges shrieked as Ellie swung the doors wide, dust blooming in the stale air like the breath of the past. The canvas map rolled open with a weighty sound, the paper crackling along creases untouched for decades. She spread it across the floor, carefully pinning the corners with grease cans and a nearby wrench. Red ink traced the coastline of a nameless Pacific island, looping in sharp arcs, dotted with hand-drawn coordinates. In one corner, beneath a faded Navy insignia, a single word had been underlined 3 times. Caligo. It meant nothing to her. But the way it was marked bold and circled like a bullseye told her it had once meant everything. She turned to the logbook again, this time digging deeper into the final section. The entries here were different. Less military, more human. One page in particular caught her eye, dated the 9th of May, 1945. It read, CM says command's not being straight with us. Orders don't match radar reports. Told her I'd fly anyway. She handed me the letter and said, if you vanish, let someone know where to look. I thought she meant metaphorically. But now, I'm not so sure. On the back of the page, scribbled sideways in pencil, was a single word. Caligo. Ellie flipped forward again, skimming pages. A name kept appearing in the margins, over and over. Commander Claire Maddox. Her breath caught. C.M. The woman from the photo. The one who left her the note. The one who had written her name on the envelope long before she ever stepped foot in this shed. Claire Maddox wasn't just a figure in her grandfather's life she had planned for Ellie. Somehow, she had known. Ellie sat back on her heels and rubbed her hands over her face. Her mind raced with impossible questions. How had this woman known about her? Why hide a plane? Why leave clues wrapped in oilcloth and locked away in a forgotten shed? She stood slowly and approached the Hellcat again, this time noticing something she'd missed. Along the fuselage, just beneath the cockpit, a name had been carefully painted in white, the letters worn but visible, Miss Nightingale. She traced the letters with her fingertips. Planes were often named, personal touches by the pilots who flew them. But this didn't feel like a nickname, it felt like a message. She opened the side compartment near the cockpit, and found another log, this one slimmer, handwritten in blue ink and signed only at the end. C.M. It was a letter, journal, and confession all at once. I knew they'd bury it. I knew they'd make it disappear. We found something we weren't supposed to, an energy spike, a radar ghost. Jack said it was just a blip, but I knew. Caligo isn't just an island. It's a wound. And this plane saw too much. Ellie's skin prickled. If you're reading this, the final paragraph began, you're part of this now. Not by blood, by choice. They'll come looking when they know she's been touched. So if you decide to keep going, to turn that key, just know, this isn't restoration, it's revelation. The page ended with coordinates, somewhere in the Pacific, somewhere real. Ellie folded the journal closed, heart hammering. This wasn't just about fixing an old plane anymore. It was about uncovering something buried by time, duty, and fear. And she wasn't sure whether to feel honored or afraid. Ellie barely slept that night. The shed, once just a curiosity on the edge of her inheritance, had become a vault of secrets. The plane wasn't just a relic, It was a sealed message. And now, with every page she turned, she felt the pressure of eyes long gone watching her, waiting to see what she would do next. By sunrise, she was back at the airfield with a thermos of burnt coffee and a notebook full of scribbled theories. She started cataloging the contents of the cabinet more carefully now, pulling each item out with gloved hands, taking photos, setting them in rows on an old tool bench. The map, the logbooks, the flight charts, even the wrap toolkits, all of it told a story. But it wasn't linear. It was fragmented, coded in a language of military jargon and quiet desperation. At the back of the cabinet, she found a box she hadn't noticed the day before. It was wooden, about the size of a shoebox, its surface stained with oil and dust. The latch was rusted, but gave way with a gentle pry of a flathead screwdriver. Inside, wrapped in waxed canvas, were 2 stacks of letters. The first were written in her grandfather's hand, but the second stack, they were signed Lieutenant Daniel Avery. A name she didn't recognize. The return address on each envelope was the same. USSX CV-9, one of the aircraft carriers that had seen heavy combat in the Pacific. She opened the top letter, dated the 3rd of June 1945. To Jack Monroe. If this makes it to you, I hope to God you're still stateside. We've had 2 recon pilots go dark near Grid 7. Maddox thinks it's tied to the energy signatures. Again. You remember what we saw. The ring of fire. The static before the blackout. We weren't supposed to be out there, orders said divert. But you and I, we always wanted the truth, didn't we? Ellie swallowed hard. The letter was filled with cryptic references to something seen in the clouds, equipment failures, and an area called Sector Caligo. It didn't read like wartime fear. It read like awe. Or maybe terror. She opened another. The XO thinks we've stumbled onto a ghost zone. Radar sees it. Then it doesn't. Sound echoes out there. Claire says there's a pattern to the signals, like they're responding. I'm not ready to believe that. Not yet. More letters followed. Over a dozen. They told a slow, terrifying descent into mystery. One referenced a storm that held position for 3 days. Another described a plane returning without its pilot, the cockpit empty, the engine still warm. The language was clinical, but beneath it, Ellie could feel the panic. The last letter, undated and smeared with what looked like oil or blood, simply said, Jack, if they bury me with this, let someone know. Don't let them tell you it was just fog. We saw it. You and me. And Claire. If you have the Hellcat, you've got the only piece of it left. She carried the signal. Ellie sat frozen, the letter in her hand, the shed dead silent except for the creak of the tin roof in the wind. This wasn't just about a lost squadron or a forgotten pilot. It was something else. Something they weren't supposed to find. Or maybe, something they weren't supposed to bring back. She looked at the Hellcat again. The words, "She carried the signal," echoed in her mind. And for the first time, Ellie wondered if starting that engine would do more than turn a propeller. Maybe it would wake something. The next day brought clouds low and thick over Birchfield. The wind had a bite to it, sharp and metallic, and the shed creaked like an old ship in harbor. Ellie stood in front of the Hellcat with a socket wrench in one hand, and her grandfather's key in the other. Her pulse was a dull roar in her ears. The letters from Lieutenant Avery had shaken her. There were truths in them, truths wrapped in code, fear, and unspoken warnings. She couldn't make sense of it all, not yet. But she knew one thing. The aircraft wasn't just a leftover from the war. It had seen something, maybe even recorded it. She thought again of that line. She carried the signal. What kind of signal? Ellie shook the thoughts from her head and focused on what she could control. Mechanics, metal, systems. She could rebuild a carburetor in her sleep, and if this thing was going to talk to her, it would start with the engine. She'd already started clearing debris from the engine bay. The cowling came off with a groan of rivets and bolts, revealing Pratt & Whitney's old R2000 800 radial engine. A beast of machinery, scarred with rust, but beautifully preserved. She expected corrosion through the ignition wires and maybe a seized crankshaft, but instead, what she found made her stop cold. The engine had been maintained. The spark plugs were new. The oil dipstick pulled clean. Someone had turned the crank recently, not just a few years ago, maybe within the last decade. That meant someone else had known about this plane, and they hadn't just hidden it. They'd kept it alive. She stepped back, her boots crunching softly over gravel and rivet heads, and stared at the propeller. It had been locked in place by time, dust, and weather. But something nagged at her, an itch, a feeling. She reached out with both hands and grabbed one of the blades. At first, nothing, but then, it shifted. Just slightly. A creak. A groan. And then, a click. She stumbled back, heart pounding, as the propeller moved no more than a few inches, like the engine had taken a shallow breath. The shed went still. Even the wind outside quieted. It wasn't possible. It shouldn't have moved. And yet, it had. Ellie crouched beside the cowling and inspected the engine again, this time noticing something else. Tucked beside the manifold was a small black box wired directly into the ignition line. It wasn't military issue. It was post-war. A data module? No label, no manufacturer. She unscrewed the bracket and gently pulled it free. The bottom was stamped with a symbol she didn't recognize, a ring of arrows circling a triangle, like some kind of unofficial seal. Across the side, etched in neat white letters, were the words, Echo Recorder divided by Caligo 6 divided by Signal Sync only. She turned it in her hands like it might explain itself. This wasn't normal. Not even close. A World War II Hellcat shouldn't have modern tech bolted into its frame, especially not with secretive markings and no serial number. The propeller groaned again. Ellie jumped. This time she hadn't touched it. The blade twitched as if moved by the air. But there was no breeze. Her breath fogged in the cool air, and she looked around the shed, suddenly aware of how alive the silence had become. Every creak of metal, every shift of dust, it all felt loaded, like the space itself was listening. She stepped back, holding the box close to her chest. "I don't know what you are," she whispered to the Hellcat, "but I think you've been waiting a long time to be found." And for the first time, she wasn't sure if she was fixing something mechanical or resurrecting something that had never died. Ellie didn't sleep that night. The echo recorder sat on her kitchen table, wrapped in a ragged shop towel, pulsing in her thoughts like a metronome she couldn't silence. She'd tried looking up the phrase Caligo 6 signal sync, but nothing came up. No government archive, no declassified blueprint, not even a conspiracy theory. It was like the device didn't exist, but she had touched it, held it. Watched the propeller shift like the plane was waking up. By morning, her decision was made. She would start the Hellcat's engine. Not to fly. Not yet. But to see what it had left to say. She returned to the shed under pale sunlight, her backpack loaded with a power pack, fresh oil, and tools. The old generator in the corner took 3 pulls to kick over. She ran a check on the fuel lines, cleaning out sediment and rust. To her surprise, the fuel tank wasn't bone dry. It held stabilized avgas. Someone, maybe her grandfather, maybe CM, had prepped it to survive. Ellie reinstalled the echo recorder into the same cradle. If it belonged in this plane, it would be part of the test. Her gut twisted as she bolted the cover in place. It didn't feel like working on a machine anymore. It felt like finishing someone else's sentence. She climbed the ladder into the cockpit, her boots scuffing the worn metal rungs. The seat creaked beneath her, the cracked leather crumbling slightly under pressure. Her hands hovered over the controls. They were familiar trim tabs, throttle quadrant, primer, magnetos. But they felt heavier. Like they remembered being used for more than practice runs. She inserted the key, her grandfather's key, into the ignition switch. It turned smoothly. Then she flipped the master. The panel lit up. Not fully. Just enough. Ellie's breath caught. That shouldn't have happened. The battery was decades dead. She double-checked the connections. Her portable pack wasn't live yet. There was no auxiliary source. And yet, there it was, the faint glow of instruments, like the plane had been waiting. She primed the engine. 3 strokes. She could hear her father's voice from her childhood, teaching her in the garage. 3's enough. Any more and you'll flood her. Throttle cracked open. Mixture full rich. She reached for the starter switch, heart thudding like a drum roll in her ears. And then, she flipped it. The engine coughed. Once. Twice. Then, with a low growl that rose like a buried roar, it caught. The shed vibrated. Dust flew from the rafters. The propeller spun. blades slicing through air heavy with history. Ellie's hands trembled, not from fear but from awe. The Hellcat was alive. Smoke belched from the exhaust ports, clearing as the engine settled into a deep, rhythmic purr, a sound that hadn't echoed in that space in nearly 80 years. The prop wash sent old papers flying. Tools clattered off shelves. And then something moved. A whisper. A shadow. In the rearview mirror mounted on the canopy frame. Ellie froze. Someone was sitting in the seat behind her. But there was no seat behind her. She turned quickly, nothing. Just the empty space behind the cockpit bulkhead. But for a moment, she could have sworn she saw the reflection of a man. Helmeted. Flight goggles pulled up. Watching her. The echo recorder's indicator light blinked green. She shut the engine down, the sudden silence roaring in her ears. The plane shook once more, and went still. She sat there for a long time, gripping the stick with white knuckles. She had started the engine, brought fire back to metal, but something else had come with it. Not a ghost, maybe. Not in the way stories told it. But a presence, and she was no longer sure who was restoring whom. Ellie didn't return to the shed for 2 days. Not because she was scared, at least. That's what she told herself, but because something about the engine start had shifted the ground beneath her feet. It wasn't just the roar of the Hellcat coming back to life. It was the moment in the rearview mirror. That impossible flicker of a man who didn't belong in this world anymore. The reflection had vanished as quickly as it appeared, but the weight of it lingered. It followed her home, into her sleep, into the quiet moments between waking and wondering. But by the third morning, she couldn't stay away. The plane wasn't finished with her, and she wasn't finished with it. She arrived with a shop cart, supplies, and a camera, not to document for fame or proof, but because she finally understood. This was history under her hands. She rolled up her sleeves, pulled on her gloves, and got to work. The fuselage came first. She started stripping old paint along the tail section, revealing bare aluminum that still gleamed in places. Beneath layers of oxidation, she found etched maintenance notes in the margins, grease pencil marks, inspection ticks, initials. It was like touching the fingerprints of the past. The canopy rails cleaned up surprisingly well. No warping. No signs of stress fractures. Whoever had stored this plane hadn't just sealed it up. They had preserved it like a relic. But even more curious were the blueprints. She had spread them across the shed floor on her first day, but only now, studying them again, did she notice the inconsistencies. Standard Hellcat schematics were easy to find online, in books, in museums. But these were different. Some wiring was rerouted. A section in the fuselage near the radio compartment was circled with the note, "Containment bracket revised per CM directive." Containment of what? She decided to open the access panel on the port side of the fuselage, the area noted in the drawing. The screws groaned in protest, resisting her touch like bones, reluctant to reveal old wounds. Behind the panel, nestled inside a tight compartment, was a small rectangular device wrapped in rubberized mesh. It looked like an amplifier. Old, but not that old. Maybe 1,970 seconds. It had no serial number, no tags. Just one switch and a set of wires feeding into the avionics bus. Ellie pulled out her phone and took a photo. But before she could examine it further, she heard something, a click. Not mechanical. Not from the plane. From behind her. She turned, wrench still in hand. Nothing. But the door to the shed, which she had latched open with a block, was now swinging gently closed, as if someone had pushed it from the outside. She stepped forward cautiously, adrenaline surging in her throat. The field beyond was empty. No vehicles, no footsteps. Just whine through the grass and the soft whine of distant power lines. She walked back inside slowly, forcing herself to breathe. Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe. But when she turned back toward the Hellcat, she froze. A fresh fingerprint, dark, oily, unmistakably human, was smeared across the inside of the cockpit glass. She hadn't touched that side. No one had. And the shape of it was long. Too long. The kind of hand made for wearing gloves, flying at altitude. Ellie stared at it for a long time, her breath shallow. This wasn't just restoration anymore. This was discovery. And whatever her grandfather and Commander Claire Maddox had been hiding inside this plane, It had just reached back. The fingerprint stayed on the glass for days. Ellie couldn't bring herself to wipe it away. Not because she was afraid of destroying evidence, but because something about it felt sacred, like touching it might undo a thread she hadn't fully traced. So it remained, an oily mark suspended in silence, watching her every time she stepped into the shed, and she kept stepping in. Something had shifted in her, not just curiosity now, but purpose. She had stopped asking why this had happened, and started asking what next. The Hellcat was responding. Whether it was science or spirit, she didn't know. But every bolt she turned, every part she polished, felt less like fixing and more like awakening. It was during a deep clean of the starboard wing bay that she found the next clue. The compartment had once housed machine guns. 50 cals, standard for the F6F. But these were gone. What sat in their place was stranger. A thick black cable ran from the firewall to a sealed module welded into the wing root. No markings, no access panel. Just a heat-stamped plate with 3 letters burned into the steel. AOS. She jotted it down and stepped outside to call a contact, Ben, a retired avionics engineer who'd helped her once before. She snapped a photo and sent it to him. 2 minutes later, he called back. "Where did you say this plane came from?" "A family shed," she said. He was quiet for too long. "That's not Navy standard," he said finally. "Hell, it's not even DOD. I've seen that module once before in an experimental signal aircraft the Air Force junked in the 70s. It was part of something called Aether Observation System. That's what AOS stands for. What does it do? No one knows. They classified everything. The only thing I heard was it picked up signatures from places radar couldn't see. Some said it was a myth. Others said it picked up more than just electromagnetic fields, some kind of harmonic distortion, like sound waves in space. Ellie felt her stomach twist. Ben kept talking. "Whatever you've got, it shouldn't be real. That system was never supposed to leave testing, and definitely never supposed to be bolted onto a World War II warbird." She ended the call and stood there for a long time. Harmonic distortion. Ghost echoes. She carried the signal. The Hellcat wasn't a fighter anymore. It was a sensor, a recorder, and maybe a witness. That night, a storm rolled over Birchfield. Thunder boomed like distant shellfire, lightning cracking the horizon in silent camera flashes. Ellie stayed in the shed long after sunset, the plane looming like a monument in the lightning-streaked dark. Around 2 a.m., just as she was packing up, a low hum filled the air. Not from the plane. From above. She stepped outside. The sky wasn't just stormlit, it was alive. Directly over the shed, clouds churned in a perfect circle, not windblown, not drifting, rotating. And in the center, a break. A hole in the sky. Perfectly round. Stars gleamed through it, but they didn't look right. Too sharp, too close. Like something was peering through from the other side. The hair on Ellie's arms lifted. Her breath stopped. The echo recorder inside the cockpit lit up. Bright green. Pulsing. Like it had found its match. And the Hellcat, dormant just moments before, ticked. A mechanical sound. A life sound. Like it heard the sky answering. The next morning the sky was cloudless. Still. Too still. Ellie hadn't slept. She sat cross-legged on the shed floor, the flight log in her lap, a thermos of cold coffee by her side. Her eyes kept darting back to the echo recorder. It hadn't blinked since 2:04 a.m., when the clouds had opened like a lens, and that strange circular void had stared back at her. The green light had pulsed 12 times, then stopped. 12. Like a clock, or a countdown, or a number of something. Missing. She pulled the logbook closer, flipping through pages she'd skimmed before. There had to be something she missed. A reference, a name, a code. And then she saw it. Squadron Echo 9. Listed under a June 1945 entry. Test deployment. Echo 9 assigned Caligo grid. Full wing, 12 aircraft. Return ETA, 043, 0 Zulu, status, pending. But no follow-up, no note, no update. No return. She scrambled for the letter from Lieutenant Avery, the final one, the one smeared in oil or blood. She read it again slowly, heart thudding. "Jack, if they bury me with this, let someone know. Don't let them tell you it was just fog. We saw it. You and me, and Claire. If you have the Hellcat, you've got the only piece of it left. She carried the signal. 12 planes. A classified grid. A signal nobody wanted recorded. Ellie set the letter aside and turned to her laptop. She opened up wartime archives, scouring for Echo 9. Nothing. The designation didn't exist. Not officially. She tried the tail numbers from the logbook, all returned errors or missing records. It was like the squadron had never flown. Or worse, like it had flown somewhere it shouldn't have. She ran a search for Caligo grid. No hits. So she mapped the coordinates from the flight log herself, plugged them into satellite imaging software, a remote patch of ocean in the South Pacific. No islands. No shipping lanes. No fly zones. Just blue. Empty. Except for a faint anomaly, a distortion pattern on the radar layer, an interference ring. The same kind of ripple you'd get from a sonar ping bouncing back off something massive and hidden. It reminded her of the old legends. Ghost fleets. Lost time. Planes that took off and never landed. Ellie sat back in her chair, breath shallow. What were they looking for? She returned to the plane, opened the cockpit, and examined the auxiliary panel she'd been too nervous to touch before. It was wired to a toggle labeled sync. The word had been scratched through by hand, and beneath it, in faint pencil, someone had written, "Do not activate alone." Her finger hovered over it. The echo recorder was dark again. But in the space behind the seat, the hollow cavity that should have been empty, she spotted a panel she hadn't seen before. Barely visible. Taped shut. She pulled at it gently, and inside found a tattered canvas envelope. Inside that, a folder labeled, "After Action Echo 9. It was full of names, all crossed out, 12 pilots. Each with final transmission notes like, "Sky split, cloud static, sea, through ocean, I think I can hear, singing. Something's watching from above us. Engine failure but no stall, just, gone." And then, underlined in red, status, missing, officially non-existent. Ellie's hands trembled. Her throat closed. Her grandfather had been part of something, seen something. But he hadn't flown that mission. Claire Maddox had, Lieutenant Avery had, Echo 9 had, and none of them came back. Except the Hellcat, which now sat before her, engine restored, eyes on the sky, waiting. Ellie wasn't expecting a knock at the shed. Not after what she'd seen. Not after the folder full of missing pilots and the sky that seemed to watch her back. But at 7:14 a.m., just as she was finishing her notes on the Echo 9 transmissions, someone rapped twice on the steel side door. Not the front. The side. The door nobody used. She froze mid-step. The shed was half-lit with morning sun, the shadows still long, the Hellcat gleaming faintly from her last polish. Ellie walked slowly to the door, wrench tucked beneath her arm, more for courage than utility. She unlatched the bolt and pulled it open. He stood there, late 70s, maybe older, weathered face, military posture, wearing a plain field jacket, frayed at the cuffs, and boots that had seen too many seasons. His eyes were sharp, but tired. "You're Monroe's granddaughter," he said without hesitation. She didn't answer at first. She'd never seen this man before. "I served with him," the stranger said. "Name's Nash. Lieutenant Colonel, retired. Last of Echo 7. She stepped back slowly. "I thought there was only Echo 9. He shook his head. "No. There were 10 Echo units. Only one came back." A long silence followed, filled only by the gentle ticking of cooling metal from the Hellcat behind her. Ellie opened the door wider. "Come in." He stepped inside with quiet reverence, eyes going immediately to the plane. He removed his cap. "She still breathes," he said, voice cracked with awe. "Didn't think I'd see her again." Ellie crossed her arms, studying him. "What do you know about Caligo?" He didn't flinch. "Too much. And not enough." He walked toward the Hellcat, one step at a time, like approaching a grave. His hand reached out and hovered over the fuselage, just short of touching it. "I watched 9 planes disappear in a clear sky. No enemy fire. No mechanical failure. They just faded. Not vanished. Faded. Like something peeled them out of time." Ellie blinked. "And you?" "I was the wingman on the edge of the proper formation. A storm front clipped me. I blacked out. Woke up 30 miles off course. No memory. Fuel untouched. Comms, silent. The rest of the squad was gone. He turned to her, voice lower. When I reported it, they transferred me. 3 weeks later, Echo 9 launched. They never came back either. Your grandfather grounded himself the day after that. Started tinkering with this plane. Told them it was his final build. But it wasn't, Ellie said, holding up the echo recorder. He modified it. She's not just a Hellcat. She's a receiver. Nash nodded. He told me once, over bourbon, that some signals aren't meant to be picked up on our side. That the sky isn't empty, just closed. Ellie stared at the recorder. She lit up during the storm. 12 pulses. Same number of planes that disappeared. Nash's expression darkened. Then, the windows opening again. She stepped toward the cockpit, the weight of the moment pulling at her bones. Why tell me all this now? Because, Nash said softly, Claire Maddox said if anyone could finish the work, it'd be the one with his hands in her heart. Ellie froze. My mother's name was Claire, she whispered. Nash nodded. They hid it. The Navy. Your family. Everyone. But you were always meant to find this. Ellie's throat went dry. Why now? Because, he said, stepping aside. This plane has been calling out for years. He turned toward the door, but paused, before leaving. When the sky opens again, he said without looking back, don't just look up. He met her eyes. Listen. And then he was gone. Ellie stood alone in the shed, the plane humming with stillness, and her mother's name echoing in her mind like an old radio transmission just now reaching home. Ellie didn't speak for hours after Nash left. She paced the shed like it was a riddle box, one she'd unlocked without realizing. The revelation sat like a weight in her chest. Claire Maddox wasn't just a name in the logs, a woman in a faded cockpit photo, or the sender of a cryptic note. She was Ellie's mother, a woman who had supposedly died in a car accident when Ellie was a baby, a woman she'd never known, a woman who had led the final Echo Squadron into the heart of whatever Caligo was, and had never returned. Except now, maybe, she had. In a way, Ellie's fingers trembled as she dug back through the materials stored in the wall cabinet. There was something she had ignored before, something too technical to make sense of at the time. A thick, weathered blueprint tube labeled E9 Mod Schematic, Maddox Revision 3. She pulled it free, unrolled it on the floor, and weighted down the corners with spare spark plugs and wrenches. The diagram inside wasn't a traditional airframe schematic. It was layered a mix of engineering, energy flow modeling, and something almost metaphysical. Circular glyphs were drawn over the fuselage in faint blue ink. At the center, the phrase, tuned resonance equals reverse echo capture. Ellie stared at it like it was a foreign language. At the bottom of the sheet, in red pencil, her grandfather had scribbled, must complete, before event window. 4.197 Hz holds stable. Risk of distortion after 15 sec. She didn't fully understand it, but the implication was clear. The plane had been tuned. Not just to fly. Not just to record. But to capture something that moved through sound frequency. Signal. Time. She moved to the Hellcat and opened the panel along the port wing again, where the modified black box was mounted. With her flashlight, she spotted something she had missed before. An access panel riveted shut, sealed with wax and a red triangle. She drilled it open slowly, heart hammering. Inside, wedged between two metal brackets, was a bundle of tightly packed cables running to a cylindrical glass tube. The tube was cracked. Not shattered, not empty, just cracked. Inside, faintly, glowing, was something like plasma. Blue. Flickering. A resonance core? A data capsule? Whatever it was, it pulsed in time with her breath. Not her heartbeat. Her breath. Like it was sinking to her presence. She stepped back, eyes wide. And then pop. A tiny spark flew from the wire bundle. The echo recorder blinked red once. Then green again. The shed lights flickered. And then, something inside the Hellcat hissed a low-pressure release, and a panel along the fuselage dropped open. She hadn't even known it existed. Inside were bullet holes. 2 of them. Clean through the frame. Exit wounds, not entry. Someone had fired from inside the plane. She reached in and pulled out a thick canvas pouch, sealed with a brass zipper. Inside, a film reel, a torn dog tag, and a single unmailed envelope addressed to Claire Monroe Maddox, care of Birchfield Airfield, her mother's name, her airfield, and her birthright. Ellie's knees buckled as she sat hard on the concrete, the pouch clutched in her lap. She had thought she was restoring a plane. But now she understood. She was finishing a message, one silenced by time, war, and fear, and she was the only one left to carry it forward. Dawn broke over Birchfield with stillness so complete, Ellie swore she could hear the dust settle. Inside the shed, the F6F Hellcat gleamed with quiet tension. Every bolt checked, every wire run. She sat in the cockpit, the weight of her grandfather's flight jacket draped over her shoulders, and breathed in the scent of oil and ghosts. She flipped the master. The panel lights blinked. Prime. Mixture. Magnetos. The engine caught on the third try, roaring awake. The shed shook. Tools rattled off shelves. The echo recorder blinked green. And then her headset crackled. This is Echo. Caligo grid. Holding pattern. Can anyone hear? Her heart stopped. The voice was live. Warbled, distant, but unmistakably now. The transmission repeated. Names, coordinates, and one word, whispered before the signal died. Claire. Her mother. 12 pulses blinked on the echo recorder. 12 planes. Still flying. Trapped somewhere. Not gone. Not yet. Ellie sat in the cockpit, tears lining her vision. This wasn't a rebuild. It was a rescue. At sunset, 2 unmarked SUVs rolled into Birchfield. Men in plain jackets stepped out. The older one called himself Shaw. The younger, Keller. They didn't knock. Miss Monroe, Shaw said, that plane isn't yours to fly. Ellie crossed her arms. It is now. They revealed photos, radar maps, spectrographs. Caligo wasn't a myth. It was a monitored anomaly, one they'd buried for decades. Your plane is tuned to it. Claire Maddox built it that way. We want it back. He offered funding, protection, silence. Ellie looked at the Hellcat, then back at them. No deal. Keller hesitated, then left a card. As their SUVs faded down the road, Ellie stood beside the Warbird, one hand resting on its wing. They weren't offering safety. They were offering a muzzle. She wouldn't wear it. Word spread. Pilots, veterans, engineers started visiting. Whispers turned to rumors. Rumors turned to offers. A museum offered 6 figures. A collector offered more. Ellie said no to all of it. Instead, she started recording everything. The signal patterns, the flight logs, the sync pulses. She modified the echo recorder, installed a backup core. The Hellcat was no longer just a relic. It was a message system. Sometimes, late at night, the radio would crackle. Maddox, mission not over. Echo persists. She began testing the resonance engine. Low power. Controlled conditions. But each test pulled clearer audio. Not ghosts, not hallucinations. People. Alive. Waiting. Caught in a slip of time. And through it all, Ellie felt her mother in the cockpit, her grandfather in every bolt, her own hands completing what they'd started. The Hellcat lifted off at dawn. Ellie guided it down the old runway, tires kissing cracked concrete, engine howling with purpose. As she climbed into the golden sky, the echo recorder blinked once, then twice, then steady. Above the clouds, the pulse returned. A tone, a frequency, a whisper in the headset. Claire, we see you. Ellie didn't speak. She just flew. Toward the grid, toward Caligo, toward a sky that might hold her family, or something stranger. Below her, Birchfield faded. Ahead, the clouds parted. And the girl who restored the forgotten plane finally became the pilot of its purpose.